Tonight, you and I are watching a woman walk back into the room that once swallowed her whole. 3 weeks ago. Arya Vale was the joke no one was brave enough to say out loud. Marcus did not just leave her. He chose her own sister at a family dinner. Then let everyone pretend Arya was the one making things awkward. They expected her to hide, but tonight, she steps into the Grand Whitmore Gala on Luca Davos' arm, a man powerful enough to make billionaires lower their voices. Above them, the 4-ton chandelier throws cold light over every polished smile. Once Arya was invisible here. Tonight, every eye turns. The light was sharp, bouncing off crystal glasses and exposing the thin layer of civility this crowd wore better than silk. Arya stood at the top of the staircase with her hand resting on Luca Davos' arm. She was not clinging to him, though her pulse was hammering hard enough to hurt. Luca murmured, "Don't to give them the pleasure. I am not doing anything yet." She whispered. "Good," he said. "Let them wonder." Somewhere below, Marcus was watching. She could feel it before she found him. Beside him stood Caroline, her sister, glowing in a pale dress and looking far too comfortable beside the man who had destroyed Arya's life. "If you stiffen," Luca warned softly, "they'll know they still matter." Arya forced her shoulders down and took the first step. They descended slowly, perfectly, while the room seemed to hold its breath. Luca was 6'3", sharp-jawed, dark-eyed, and dressed like a man who had never had to ask permission. But Arya noticed his hand tighten once around hers. He was performing too. When they reached the floor, a waiter appeared. Luca took 2 glasses of champagne and handed one to her. "Hold it," he said. "You don't have to drink. I know how champagne works," she muttered. He almost smiled. Then looked left. Marcus just remembered how to panic. Arya turned just enough to see him. Marcus stood near the bar, frozen with his glass halfway to his mouth. The color had drained from his face. Caroline touched his sleeve, but he barely seemed to feel it. That small betrayal of attention pleased Arya more than it should have. She looked away before Marcus could catch her staring. "How do you feel?" Luca asked. "Like I might throw up." "That means you re-alive. That is not helpful." "It's honest." They moved deeper into the room, whispers opening around them like cracks in ice. Arya recognized Marcus' friends, his investors, people who had watched her humiliation and chosen silence because silence was easier. "Smile," Luca said under his breath. "I am smiling." "No, you look like you planning a murder." "I'm considering one. This time." Luca's mouth twitched. Later she softened her expression, letting the room see calm instead of damage. He guided her toward a powerful circle near the windows. 3 women. 2 men, all rich enough to mistake boredom for elegance. Robert Whitmore reached for Luca's hand, but his eyes slid quickly to Arya. "And who is this?" he asked, as if he already knew she was trouble. Luca did not hesitate. "Arya Vale," he said, giving her name weight. "Photographer. The only interesting person in this room." Robert took her hand and paused, recalculating. A sharp blonde woman leaned closer. "Vale," she said. "I've heard that name." Arya's stomach tightened. Luca answered too smoothly. "Editorial work. Vogue circles. Prestige has been watching her." Arya shot him a warning look. He ignored it. It was not exactly a lie, but it was dressed like one. The blonde nodded, suddenly eager to believe she knew. "Of course." The group began speaking about mergers, but Arya noticed Caroline watching from across the room. Lips pressed thin. 10 minutes later, Luca led Arya away. "You handled that well," he said. "You lied. I opened a door. That's what men call lying when it benefits them." Luca stopped, and for the first time that night, his confidence cracked. "Fair," he said quietly. Arya took a sip of champagne, dry and bitter on her tongue. "I don't want to become somebody's project." "You not. Then don't polish me in front of strangers." He looked as if he wanted to argue, then chose not to. Point taken. Before she could answer, a familiar voice cut through the noise. Marcus stood a few feet away, pale and restless. Up close, he looked smaller than she remembered. His eyes moved from her face to Luca. Then back again. Can we talk? He asked behind him. Caroline watched like a woman seeing a door close. We are talking, Luca said, stepping beside Arya. His voice was calm, but there was steel under it. Marcus ignored him. Arya, please. I just need 5 minutes. You had 6 months, Arya said. The words came out colder than she expected. Marcus flinched. That's not fair. A laugh almost escaped her. Not fair, Caroline started toward them, but stopped when several heads turned. Marcus lowered his voice. I made a mistake. Arya looked at him for a long second. No, Marcus. You made choices. Lots of them. His face reddened. Donna, do this here. You did it at my mother's dinner table. Then she turned and walked toward the terrace, leaving him exposed in the middle of the room. Outside, the cold air struck her face like water. Luca followed, closing the balcony door behind them. That was stronger than anything I coached you to do, he said. Arya gripped the stone railing. I hated every second. Good. Hatred can keep your knees from giving out. She looked at him. Is that what kept you standing? His eyes shifted to the city lights below. For a while, he did not explain. And she did not press. Down in the ballroom, Marcus and Caroline were arguing in tight whispers, their perfect scandal beginning to rot in public. Arya should have felt victorious. Instead, she felt hollow, as if revenge had opened a room inside her and found it empty. Luca straightened his cuffs, but Arya noticed his hands were not completely steady. Your sister is coming, he said. She's angry. Of course she is. Arya's breath caught as Caroline stepped onto the balcony with a glass in one hand and wounded innocence on her face. Arya, Caroline said softly. Can we not make a scene? Arya stared at her. You made one when you slept with my partner. Caroline's eyes flashed. It wasn't that simple. It never is when you read the one holding the knife. Luca stayed silent, giving Arya the space to stand alone. Caroline looked past her to him. Is this what you do now? Collect dangerous men to prove a point. Arya felt the hit land, but she did not step back. Caroline wore pale pink, pearls at her throat. Her hair swept up like she had arrived as the heroine of her own tragedy. No, Arya said. I stopped collecting excuses for people who hurt me. Caroline's mouth opened, then closed. For once, no perfect line arrived to save her. Through the glass doors, several guests pretended not to watch. Luca finally spoke. Miss Vale, your sister owes you privacy, not another performance. Caroline's smile sharpened. And you owe her what? Mr. Devo. A rescue, a favor, or a debt she doesn't understand yet. The words hung there. Arya turned slowly toward Luca. His silence told her Caroline had struck something real. Luca's jaw tightened. Go inside. Carol, gladly, she said, but her eyes stayed on Arya. Just be careful. Men like him that do anything for free. Then she vanished back into the glittering room. Arya waited until the door closed. What did she mean? Luca looked away. She wanted to shake you. Did she lie? The orchestra began a waltz inside, soft and cruelly beautiful. Luca extended his hand. Dance with me. Not for them. For you, Arya almost refused. Then she saw Marcus watching through the glass, wounded pride all over his face. She took Luca's hand. On the floor, they moved slowly, every eye following them. But Arya no longer knew whether she was winning or being moved across a board she could not see. When the music ended, Luca released her too carefully, as if he had remembered she could break. They left the dance floor and slipped into a quieter hallway behind the ballroom. Arya turned on him there. Tell me the truth. His expression closed. Not here, then where? After you buy me a career. After everyone thinks I belong to you. His eyes hardened at that. You don't belong to anyone. Then stop acting like my life is something you can arrange. The old Arya would have apologized. This one did not. Luca looked at her for a long moment, and something tired crossed his face. I made one call, he said, for a reason I should have told you. That was not an answer. It was another locked door. They returned to the ballroom, only long enough to be seen leaving. Marcus said nothing, but Caroline smiled with the satisfaction of a person who had planted poison and trusted it to spread. Arya kept her chin high until the heavy door of Lucas' black sedan closed around her. Only then did she let out the breath trapped in her chest. What reason? She asked. Lucas stared forward. The magazine you've wanted for years. I have influence there. Influence. Ownership. Her stomach dropped. You used me tonight. Then placed me in your world. No, he said sharply. I used my world to put you where your work already belonged. That sounds beautiful, she whispered. And dangerous. The gala lights blurred behind them as the car slid through the dark streets. Luca did not speak for several blocks. When he finally did, his voice had lost its polished edge. I know what it feels like to be erased by people who smile while doing it. Arya watched his reflection in the window. That doesn't give you permission to make decisions for me. I know, the admission was quiet and almost painful. Outside her building. The car stopped. She stepped onto the curb, cold air wrapping around her bare arms. Thank you for tonight, she said, because the night had still saved something in her. Then she added, but don't confuse helping me with owning the next chapter. Luca nodded once. I want tea, she hoped he meant it. Her apartment greeted her with silence, stale coffee, and the faint lavender candle she never remembered lighting. She kicked off her heels and stood in the dark, suddenly exhausted. Her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. You were magnificent tonight. Sleep well. She stared at it for a long time. A warmer version of herself might have smiled. Instead, she saw Caroline's warning. Lucas' secret ownership. Marcus' wounded face. Her hands began to shake. Not from fear exactly, but from too many truths arriving at once. She turned on the kitchen light and tried to breathe slowly, but her chest refused. The moment she was finally alone, all the strength she had borrowed from the room fell away. She sank onto the cold kitchen floor and cried until time blurred. It was not graceful. It was not healing. It was ugly, breathless, and necessary. When it passed, she felt emptied out, but clear. She crawled into bed and slept until late morning, when sunlight cut through the blinds and her phone vibrated again and again. 12 missed calls. 23 messages. People who had ignored her pain now wanted details about the man beside her. One text from Marcus sat near the top. Sent from a new number. Please don't let him turn you into someone I don't recognize. Arya almost laughed. He had recognized her only when another man made her visible. Then her mother's name appeared on the screen. Arya answered before she could talk herself out of it. Do you have any idea what you did last night? Her mother demanded. No hello, nor are you okay. Just damage control. I attended a gala. With Luca Devo. Caroline is devastated. Arya closed her eyes. Caroline slept with Marcus. That is not what I called about. The words landed harder than expected. Her mother warned her about Lucas' reputation. About money. Power and men who enjoyed broken women. Arya listened until the old ache turned sharp. You were afraid of him, she said. But you were never afraid of what Marcus did to me. Silence filled the line. Her mother finally said, This family has suffered enough. Arya's voice went cold. No, I suffered. You all managed the embarrassment. Then she ended the call before guilt could crawl back in. In the kitchen, she made bitter coffee and opened her laptop, intending to disappear into work. One unread email waited at the top of her inbox. Subject: opportunity. She almost deleted it, afraid of what Luca had done, afraid of what refusing might cost her. But fear had made enough decisions for her already. She opened it. Elaine Cortez, senior editor at Prestige, wanted to discuss an editorial series. Arya read the message 3 times, her heart racing. Prestige had rejected her a year earlier with an automated email that felt like a door slammed in her face. Now the same door stood open, and Arya knew Luca's hand was on the knob. She searched his name, then the magazine's parent company. There it was in the financial news. 6 months earlier, Luca Devo had bought a controlling stake. She snapped the laptop shut so hard the sound echoed. Anger came first. Then shame for being angry at an opportunity she wanted badly enough to ache. Her phone vibrated. Lunch at 1. I'll send a car. She stared at the message. Her pride wanted to refuse. Her ambition wanted answers. She typed, I'll come, but I am not accepting anything until you tell me everything. By 12:45, a quiet black sedan waited outside. Arya almost turned back twice before getting in. The car carried her into an older part of the city, where narrow brick streets and shuttered windows made everything feel hidden. The restaurant had no sign, only a faded number by the door. Inside, Luca sat in a corner booth with a glass of water and the look of a man expecting a fight. He stood when she approached. You came, he said. Dante sounded relieved. I came angry. I know. She sat across from him without removing her coat. You got me that job. I got you looked at, because you own the room where they decide who matters. Luca accepted the hit without flinching. Yes, that single word disarmed her more than denial would have. I did it tell Elaine to hire you, he said. I sent your work and told her not to ignore it. Arya's laugh was short. You had never seen my work. I had this morning. Your website is outdated. The contact page is broken, and half the links lead nowhere. She hated how specific he was. But the photographs are beautiful, he added. You see people when they were trying not to be seen. The anger in her chest shifted. Not disappearing, but changing shape. That still does to make it okay. No, he said. It makes it useful, not okay. Arya looked down at the menu to hide the emotion rising in her face. Luca ordered in low Italian, then pushed the menu aside. You asked for everything. He paused. 5 years ago, I was engaged to Isabel. She left 2 weeks before the wedding for my business partner, a man I trusted with every contract, every weakness, every plan. Arya went still. I am sorry. Don't be too kind yet, he said. The part I don't like telling is what I became after. His eyes hardened. I ruined him. Not illegally. Not even unfairly. I just made sure every door he needed was locked. Arya felt a chill. Luca did not sound proud. That made it worse. He deserved consequences. Arya said carefully. Maybe Luca lifted his glass but did not drink. But somewhere in the middle of destroying him, I stopped caring where justice ended and revenge began. The confession sat between them, heavier than the silverware. Is that what this is? Arya asked. Revenge against Marcus. No, his answer came too fast. Then he exhaled. Maybe at first. A little. I saw you standing alone at that dinner weeks ago. I knew the look on your face. I wanted him to feel small, and me, I wanted you to remember you weren't he. She wanted to believe that. She also wanted not to need his explanation. The food arrived, but Arya barely touched it. I don't want to become hard, she said. I don't want to wake up one day and realize pain turned me into someone cruel. Lucas' expression softened in a way that made him look younger. Then keep asking that question. Cruel people usually don't. That sounds comforting. It's not, it's work. He leaned back. I am still doing it badly. There it was, the flaw beneath the suit. The man beneath the myth. Arya let herself see him, but only a little. Marcus left a voicemail, she admitted. Lucas' mouth tightened. Do you want to hear it? Part of me does. Then listen, when you re strong enough not to confuse regret with love. Arya hated how gently he said it. What if he means it? He might. Luca did not give her the easy answer. People can be sorry and still be unsafe. She looked at him. Did Isabel ever apologize? A year later. And I hung up. Did that heal you? He gave a humorless smile. No, but it stopped her from using my forgiveness as a sleeping pill. Arya sat with that. The restaurant around them hummed softly, private and dim. I don't know how to forgive without letting people back in, she whispered. Luca's voice lowered. Then don't start with forgiveness. Start with distance. Let the truth prove itself from there. She traced the edge of her chipped nail and remembered the Sunday dinner that had cracked her life open. Marcus had arrived late. Caroline was already there. Too bright. Too nervous. Watching the door before anyone else did. When Arya's mother joked about grandchildren, Marcus had frozen and looked at Caroline. Not Arya, she had noticed. She had simply refused to understand. Later, in the hallway, she confronted him. He said it had just happened. 6 months of secret messages. Hotel rooms. Lies and careful timing. And he called it an accident. Caroline cried and said they never meant to hurt her. Arya remembered staring at them both and realizing they had already rehearsed being sorry. Luca listened without interrupting, but his knuckles tightened around his glass. "Did your family know?" he asked. "I don't know." That was the part that haunted her. Not knowing who had been blind and who had simply looked away. "My mother keeps saying Caroline is fragile." Arya laughed softly, without humor. "I was the one who got broken. But Caroline is the one everyone is afraid to upset." Luca's eyes sharpened. "Then stop protecting them from what they did." "Then what?" "Blow up my family." They lit the match. "You are not responsible for carrying the smoke." She wanted to argue. Instead, she looked out the window and wondered how many years she had spent, making other people comfortable at her own expense. An hour later, they stepped into the crisp evening air. Luca waved away his waiting car and chose to walk. Their footsteps cut through the quiet street. "Tell me something true," he said. "Something ugly." Arya shoved her hands into her coat pockets. "I'm afraid I go back to being easy. Easy to forgive. Easy to use. Easy to replace." Luca stopped beneath a flickering street lamp. "You won tea." "You don't know that." "No," he admitted. "I didn't, but I know this. The old you would have thanked me for the job, apologized for being upset, and gone home confused. Today you came ready to fight." A reluctant smile touched her mouth. "I was rude. You were clear." Later, alone in her room, Arya finally played Marcus' voicemail. His voice filled the dark, stripped of its old confidence. He called himself a coward. He said Caroline was not who he thought she was. He said seeing Arya with Luca had made him realize what he had lost. That line made her stop breathing. "Not I hurt you. Not I betrayed you. What I lost." Even in regret, he was standing at the center of the story. She played the message once more, hoping for something different, and found only the same hollow ache. Then she deleted it. Her finger hovered over block. This time, she pressed it and did not undo it. The silence afterward felt strange, almost too large. Arya emailed Elaine Cortez and accepted the meeting before fear could talk her out of it. Then she texted Luca. "I listened. I blocked him." A minute later, he replied, "Proud of you." She stared at the words longer than she should have. Another message followed. "Also, I was wrong to move pieces without asking you. I'm sorry." That one mattered more. Arya did not know what to do with a powerful man who apologized without turning it into a performance. She typed and erased 3 answers before settling on. "Don't to do it again." His reply came quickly. "I won tea for the first time all day." She believed him a little. 2 days later, Elaine Cortez called. Her voice was sharp, direct and too busy for flattery. Prestige needed a photographer for a 12-page feature in New York. A series on women who had rebuilt themselves in public. Elaine wanted portraits that showed vulnerability without making it look weak. "Luca sent your portfolio," she said, "but I don't work for Luca." Arya's spine straightened. "Then why me?" Elaine paused. "Because your photos look like you waited for the subject to stop pretending. That's rare." The fee was $15,000. Arya nearly dropped the phone. When the call ended, she sat very still, afraid that moving too fast might break the moment. Trying to sound calm, Elaine offered me the project. He answered with a single line. She saw what I saw. Arya wanted to be grateful. She was, but frustration rose with it. "You opened the door without asking," he replied. "Yes, I am trying to learn the difference between help and control." That honesty softened her more than charm would have. When he invited her to dinner, she hesitated for 10 full minutes. Getting closer to him felt like standing beside deep water, beautiful and dark. She finally agreed, but added one condition. No more surprises involving my career. His answer was immediate. Deal then. After a pause, he wrote, I probably still annoy you. She smiled despite herself. At 7, Luca waited downstairs in his sleek sedan. Arya had spent an hour staring at her closet, rejecting anything that looked like she was trying too hard or pretending not to try at all. In the end, she chose black trousers and a dark silk blouse. Simple enough to feel like herself. Luca opened the door before his driver could. You look like trouble, he said. Careful. I am still mad at you. I assumed. Good, the small bistro he chose had exposed brick. Low light. And almost no customers. It felt less like a place to impress someone, and more like a place to tell the truth. That made her nervous. Over red wine and dark whiskey, Arya admitted she was afraid of New York. Not just failing. Succeeding. If the photos are good, people will say it was because of you, she said. If they re-bad, they'll say I never belonged. Luca swirled his drink. People will say whatever keeps them from looking at their own empty lives. That sounds like something a rich man says when people can hurt him. He looked up. Stung, they can. Then don't pretend they can tea. The corner of his mouth lifted, but his eyes stayed serious. You getting very good at stabbing me politely. I am practicing. Good, use that in New York. He told her the work would have to stand on its own. No room, no name. No man could take the photograph for her. That's the part no one can fake. He said, when she said success seemed easy for him. The mask slipped. He admitted he had spent 10 years building a fortress out of fear. He had power, but not peace. He had rooms full of people who respected him because they were afraid not to. And that's enough? She asked. He looked down. Some nights. No, the answer was so bare that she did not know what to say. For the first time, Luca Devo looked less like a savior and more like a man trapped inside his own legend. As dinner ended, Arya asked about Isabel. Luca's eyes cooled at once. She called a year after leaving. He said she cried. She apologized. She said she had been confused. Were you tempted to answer? I did answer. Arya waited. I told her confusion did not last 6 months. Book a venue. Kiss my business partner. And empty our apartment while I was at work. Arya's breath caught. Then I hung up. There was no triumph in his voice. Only scar tissue. Did you ever want to hurt her? She asked. He did not pretend. Yes, did you? No, that was the one decent thing I managed. Coffee arrived. And Arya wrapped her hands around the cup. I envy how you command a room, she admitted. You shouldn't he? Why? Because half of it is theater. And the other half is exhaustion. He looked toward the empty tables. At the gala, I knew where every rival stood, who owed me, who hated me, who would smile while waiting for me to bleed. That is T confidence. It is surveillance. Arya pictured him beneath the chandelier, calm and untouchable, while his hand had tightened around hers. So why keep doing it? She asked. His silence stretched. Because if I stop, he said, I have to find out who I am when no one is afraid of me. Outside, the autumn air was cold enough to sting. They walked past dark storefronts, their reflections moving beside them in the glass. What are you going to do about your family? Luca asked. Arya let out a tired breath. I don't know. Part of me wants to scream. Part of me wants to disappear. Both are understandable. Neither lets you decide the story. You say that like it's easy. It isn't. He stopped near a street lamp. You can fight them. Leave them. Or forgive them later if they earn it. But don't sit still while they turn you into the problem. Arya hated how badly she needed those words. She hated even more that they were true. I only feel strong because you here, she admitted. Luca's face softened, but he did not rush to comfort her. Then borrow it for now. Just on mistake borrowed strength for a home. The honesty unsettled her. What happens when you get bored? She asked. When fixing me stops being interesting. Something dark crossed his face. I'm not fixing you. Then what are you doing? He looked away before answering, trying not to repeat myself. She did not understand. Not fully, but she heard the warning underneath. Luca was not simple. His kindness had edges. His help came from wounds he had not finished cleaning. Arya knew then that trusting him would not be safe. It would have to be chosen carefully. Her phone vibrated. Caroline's name lit the screen. Arya stopped walking. Messages filled the display. We need to talk. You embarrassed me. Marcus is confused. Yuri letting Luca poison you against your own family. The words were so perfectly Caroline that Arya almost smiled. Even now her sister could turn betrayal into inconvenience. What do you want to do? Luca asked. The question mattered because he did not tell her. Arya read the messages once more, letting the old memories hurt. Whispered secrets. Borrowed dresses. Birthdays. The sister she had loved. Then she blocked the number. Her hand shook afterward, but she did not regret it. I chose peace, she said. Luca nodded. That's not a small thing. The car waited on the quiet street, but neither of them moved toward it right away. Arya stared at the dark screen of her phone. She'll call my mother now. Probably, and my mother will call me cruel. Probably, you re terrible at comforting people. I am excellent at not lying. Despite herself. Arya laughed. The sound surprised them both. In the car, the city passed in streaks of light. At her door, she thanked him, then caught herself. Luca raised an eyebrow. Progress, he said. Donna looked so pleased. I'm trying not to. Before leaving, he told her she was stronger than she realized. This time, she did not thank him. She simply said, I am starting to know. Inside, her apartment felt too quiet after the city. She made tea and let it go cold while she drafted a message to her mother. She wrote everything. That Caroline had not made a mistake. That Marcus had not fallen in love. That 6 months of lies were not a storm but a construction. She wrote that she could no longer be the soft place where everyone buried their guilt. Then she read it 3 times and deleted it. Not because she was afraid, but because sending it would still be asking her mother to understand. Arya opened her editing software instead. If no one in her family wanted the truth, she would put her attention somewhere that could not gaslight her back. She worked until her eyes burned, sketching concepts for the New York shoot. Portraits with shadows, hands, unfixed hair. Women not smiling because the world demanded it. Around midnight, another unknown number flashed on her phone. A photo appeared before the text loaded. Marcus and Caroline outside the gala, arguing near the valet stand. Then came the message from Marcus. She lied to me too. Please call. Arya stared at it, stunned by his audacity. Caroline had betrayed her. Marcus had betrayed her. Now he wanted Arya to become a witness for his pain. She deleted the photo, blocked the number, and turned the phone face down. Some doors needed more than closing. They needed locks. The next 3 weeks disappeared into contracts, equipment lists, and sleepless planning. Work became a shelter, but not a soft one. It demanded everything. Luca checked in with short messages, careful not to push. 2 days before her flight, her mother called. Her voice sounded tired, thinner than before. Caroline says you blocked her. Arya closed her eyes. Yes, she is devastated. Good, maybe she'll learn what consequences feel like. Her mother flinched on the other end of the line. Then quietly, she said she had not known about Caroline and Marcus. Arya wanted to believe her. She also remembered every time her mother had chosen peace over truth. If you had known, Arya asked, would you have protected me or protected the family? The silence after that was answer enough. Her mother began to cry, softly at first. Then with the broken exhaustion of someone finally seeing the shape of her own failure. She said she was sorry. She said Arya had deserved better. The words mattered, but they did not repair anything on contact. They ended with a careful invitation to Thanksgiving, not a demand. After hanging up, Arya sat still in the dim room. Relief and grief moved through her together. Impossible to separate. The next day, Luca asked her to come to his office. She almost refused. afraid of another grand gesture. She went anyway. She expected cold glass and steel. Instead, S' office was in an old brick building full of afternoon light, crowded bookshelves, and papers stacked in impatient towers. He slid an envelope across the desk. Inside was a check for $20,000. Arya pushed it back immediately. No, it's for equipment. I said no. Your lenses are scratched. Your backup body is 5 years old, and New York will punish every weakness. Then let it punish me. Lucas' face tightened. Why? Because I need one thing in my life that no one can say you bought. That landed. He looked down at the check, then slowly took it back. You rewrite, he said. I am sorry. The apology changed the room. Luca opened a drawer and removed a business card instead. This is a rental house. I've already arranged nothing. You call them. Choose what you need. Negotiate your own terms. I'll stay out of it. Arya studied him. Suspicious. You relearning. Slowly, painfully. Under supervision. She almost laughed. Mine, apparently. For the first time, a real smile softened his face. When he asked if she was ready for New York, Arya admitted she was not. But I am going. That is usually how ready looks, he said, as she turned to leave. He added, Arya, make them remember your work. Not my name. She nodded. That, at least, was something she could accept. She boarded the plane with rented gear, a half-packed heart, and a pressure beneath her ribs that would not ease. New York met her with cold noise, impatient horns, and people rushing as if the whole city were late. Her hotel room on the 11th floor was sleek, empty and far too quiet. Luca texted once. Landed, she wrote back, terrified. His reply came quickly. Good, it means you not numb. She set the phone down and prepared her lenses for the 8 women she would photograph over the next 3 days. Sleep did not come. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Elaine's face. Marcus' message, Carolina's smile, and the possibility of failing where everyone could see. Hunger and anxiety drove her out into the city with her camera. She photographed wet pavement, a sleeping man under a scaffolding, graffiti peeling from brick, a woman smoking outside a closed diner. No one knew her. No one cared. Strangely, that helped. By 4 she returned to the hotel with aching feet and a memory card full of lonely things. At 6:30, Elaine called. Car at 7:30. First shoot at 9. I'll be ready, Arya said, though she was not sure that was true. In the mirror, she looked exhausted, wired and fiercely awake. Maybe ready was not a feeling. Maybe it was just showing up with shaking hands. The Brooklyn studio was a converted warehouse with concrete floors, tall windows, and too many people pretending they were not judging her. Elaine met her in black, shook her hand once, and got straight to business. Luca speaks highly of you, she said. Arya braced herself. Elaine's eyes narrowed. That buys you nothing here. If you waste my set, I will replace you before lunch. Oddly, Arya liked her more for that. In the back of the room, Maya Chen waited in a tailored suit that probably cost more than Arya's rent. Her face held the polished emptiness of someone who had spent years answering questions without revealing a thing. Arya lifted her camera and felt the room go quiet. Maya sat near the window, legs crossed, hands folded, smile perfect and useless. Arya took a few test shots and knew they were dead. Pretty, expensive. Lifeless, she lowered the camera. Why did you agree to this? Maya blinked. Excuse me. Elaine looked up sharply. Arya ignored her, a feature about redefining success. You already have investors. Headlines. Influence. So why sit here and pretend you enjoy being photographed? For the first time. Maya's smile faltered. A producer coughed. Someone whispered Arya's name like a warning. Then Maya laughed once. Surprised and almost real. You're either brave, she said, or very bad at reading rooms. Arya lifted the camera again. Both lately. Maya leaned back, and the polished surface cracked just enough for fatigue to show. She admitted her public relations team wanted her to appear more human. Then quieter. She said she was no longer sure how much of that human side remained. She slept 4 hours a night, rarely saw her family, and carried 200 employees on decisions she sometimes made while guessing. Click. Arya caught the truth before Maya could smooth it away. What happens if you stop? Arya asked. Maya's eyes shifted toward the window. Then I have to find out whether there's anything left of me without the company. Click. The room changed after that. Even Elaine stopped pretending not to listen. For an hour, Arya worked past the suit, the posture, the practiced answers. By the end, Maya's jacket was off, her hair was loose, and her eyes looked tired in a way that felt honest instead of weak. That was uncomfortable, Maya said when they finished. Arya lowered the camera. Good uncomfortable or bad uncomfortable? Maya considered it necessary. The rest of the day followed the same raw rhythm. A single mother who had built a company after bankruptcy. An injured athlete turned coach. A writer published at 50 after 30 years of rejection. Each arrived armored. Each resisted. Each eventually let something true show. Arya's back ached, but every frame felt alive. The last subject left after 8. Arya's eyes burned, and her hands shook from too much coffee. Elaine approached while Arya packed. You took a risk with Maya. I know don't to do it again, unless you know exactly why you're redoing it. Arya braced for criticism. But Elaine continued. Today you knew why. The files by morning. Back at the hotel, Arya found 6 missed calls, including one from Luca, and one from an unknown number she already feared. She called Luca first. I am exhausted, she said. Did you fail? I'd think so. Then be exhausted proudly. His warm laugh loosened something in her chest. For once, she let it. The next 2 days blurred together. More subjects. More guarded faces. More moments where Arya had to choose between safe beauty and difficult truth. On the 3rd day, Elaine sat beside her, scrolling through the raw files in heavy silence. Arya could barely breathe. Finally, Elaine looked up. These are very good. Arya stared. Very good or polite, very good. I am not polite. A laugh escaped before Arya could stop it. Elaine continued. I want you for our next series on legacy. Before Arya could answer, Elaine's phone buzzed. Her expression changed. She turned the screen toward Arya. A gossip post had just gone live. Devo's new muse gets prestige spotlight. Arya read the headline twice, her stomach turning cold. Beneath it was a blurred photo from the gala. Luca's hand at her waist, her face lifted toward him like a woman being presented. Not hired. The article suggested the feature had been bought before she ever entered the studio. It mentioned Marcus by name as a former partner concerned about her sudden rise. Elaine said nothing for a long moment. Did you know this was coming? She asked. No, Arya's voice sounded far away. Did Luca arrange more than he admitted? That question hit like a slap. Arya stood, shaking. Judge the files, she said. Not the man in the photograph. Elaine's eyes hardened. Then prove I can. Elaine gave her 1 night. No assistance. No Luca, no calls from anyone with power. Arya had to select, edit, and build the full 12-page visual sequence herself. If the work survived without the protection of his name, it stayed. If not, Elaine would kill the feature before morning. Back at the hotel, Arya ignored Luca's calls and opened every raw file. Anger sharpened her hands. Marcus had found one more way to stand in the center of her story, and this time he had aimed at her work. She edited until the city outside turned black, choosing the ugliest truths, the most honest faces, the frames no committee would have dared to fake. Someone knocked on her hotel door. Arya looked through the peephole and saw Luca in the hallway, coat still on, face stripped of its usual calm. She opened the door only as far as the chain allowed. Did you know? She asked. No, did you give anyone the impression I was yours to place? He flinched. Probably. That honesty almost hurt more than a lie. Marcus fed the story. Luca said. My team traced it to him. Of course they did. Your team fixes things. Arya, no, you don't get to fix this. She closed the door before he could answer. On the other side, he stayed silent. Then his footsteps faded. The final sequence took shape just before dawn. 12 portraits. No glamour. No apology. Each image seemed to ask what success costs when the world keeps trying to own your face. Arya wrote a short note to Elaine. If you run these, run them because they are good. If you don't, kill the story because they are not. But do not make either choice because of Luca Devo. She sent the files at 6:13. Then she sat on the floor beside the bed, too tired to cry. At 8, Elaine called. Her voice was flat. Come to the studio. Arya's heart dropped. Is it bad? It's inconvenient, Elaine said. Usually that means it's worth printing. At the studio, Elaine had pinned the images across a white wall. Everyone was quiet. Maya Chen stood near her portrait, studying herself as if meeting a stranger. This one, Maya said, touching the edge of the print, is the first photo of me I don't want to correct. Elaine turned to Arya. The feature runs. Arya's knees nearly failed. And the gossip. Elaine's mouth tightened. We answer with the work. Then she added, but understand this. From now on, they will look for every crack in you. Arya looked at the portraits, then at the room watching her. Let them, she said. This time. She meant it. Her apartment looked exactly the same when she returned home, but she did not feel like the same woman stepping into it. Elaine's email arrived that evening. These are exceptional. Your credit will run next month. Arya opened the 12 final images one by one. They were raw, clean, and alive. Her phone rang. Luca, she almost let it go unanswered, then picked up. I saw Elaine's note, he said. Congratulations. Marcus tried to bury me with your name. I know, and you made it easier for him. Falk silence, then Luca said. Yes, no excuse followed. That was the only reason she stayed on the line. I wanted to be the door. Luca said quietly. I didn't understand I might become the shadow blocking the work. Arya closed her eyes. I can to build a life inside your shadow. I know, so step back. The words frightened her as soon as she said them, but she did not take them back. Luca's breath moved softly through the phone. For how long? Until my name can stand in a room before yours enters it. He did not argue. Then I'll step back. After they hung up, Arya opened an email to her mother. She wrote that she was not ready to see Caroline, and might never be, but she would meet her mother alone, if they could speak honestly, without excuses. She pressed send before hesitation could freeze her fingers. It was not dramatic. No music swelled. The room did not change. But something inside her stood up a little straighter. 2 days later, her mother replied, agreeing to meet alone on the Saturday before Thanksgiving. Arya read the message several times, searching for a trap, but found only a tired, careful yes. They chose 2 in the afternoon. In the days that followed, Arya buried anxiety in work and silence. She rebuilt her portfolio, removed old polished images, and did not call Luca. He kept his promise. No surprise cars. No favors. No doors opening before she reached them. By Friday night, anxiety took over her apartment. She scrubbed clean counters, rearranged furniture, then moved it back because everything looked wrong. Saturday arrived gray and freezing. She burned toast, changed clothes 3 times, and kept checking the window like a frightened child. At exactly 2, her mother's car pulled up. Arya watched her step out, clutching her purse to her chest like a shield. She looked older than Arya remembered, smaller too, as if the last few weeks had taken something from her. Arya opened the door before she could knock. They stood there, caught between habit and hurt, before her mother reached forward for a brief, uncertain hug. Arya held her, and the familiar scent of her mother's perfume brought back 100 memories she was not ready to sort through. Inside, they made awkward comments about the furniture and the cold. Arya poured tea neither of them drank. At the kitchen table, her mother wrapped both hands around the mug. I was sure you let me in. She said I wasn't sure either. The honesty startled them both. A heavy silence settled. Not angry exactly, but crowded. Her mother asked about New York. Arya told her about the shoot, then about the gossip post. Her mother went pale when she heard Marcus's name attached to it. "I failed you," her mother said, and the words came rough, not rehearsed. Arya froze. "When you needed me to stand up for you, I chose quiet. I told myself I was protecting the family, but I was protecting myself from conflict." Tears slipped down her face. "You paid for my cowardice." Arya's throat tightened. She had expected defense, excuses, the old language of both sides. Instead, her mother named the wound plainly. "I made Caroline fragile because it was easier than making her accountable," she continued. "And I made you strong because I thought strong children needed less protection." Arya looked away before the tears could fall too easily. "Why now?" Arya asked. Her mother looked down. "Because Caroline called me after Marcus left her." Arya's chest went cold. "He left her." "Yes," a pause. "And then Marcus called me too. He said the article would teach you humility." Arya's fingers tightened around the mug. Her mother's voice broke. "For one terrible second, I almost told you to ignore it. To be bigger. Then I heard myself." She looked up. Ashamed, I realized I was about to ask the daughter who had been betrayed to carry the daughter who betrayed her, and to excuse the man who was still trying to punish her. The room seemed to tilt around Arya. "What did you do?" Arya asked. Her mother swallowed. "I told him never to contact this family again. Then I told Caroline that if she defended him, she could lose me too." Arya stared at her, stunned by the unfamiliar shape of protection. "I should have done it sooner," her mother whispered. "I know that." Part of Arya wanted to collapse into relief. Another part held back, cautious and bruised. "Words are easy," she said. Her mother nodded. "Then watch what I do next." Outside, a car alarm wailed and faded, absurdly ordinary against the weight of the conversation. Nothing was fixed. But for once, Arya was not the only person in the room holding the truth. Arya admitted she could not forgive Caroline. She was not sure she could forgive her mother either. Her mother accepted it without flinching. "I don't deserve a deadline," she said. "I only want the chance to become safer than I was." That sentence stayed with Arya. They spent the next hour talking carefully, not repairing everything, but learning how not to perform. Her mother asked about the photographs and actually listened. Arya asked about her father and heard the loneliness behind her mother's marriage. When they finally stood, nothing was complete, but the room felt less poisoned. Her mother did not ask to see her again. She only said, "When you are ready, I will show up differently." They parted with a long embrace and quiet words of love that did not feel automatic. After her mother left, Arya sat on the couch and let grief and relief move through her together. Her phone stayed silent. No Luca, no rescue. No careful message arriving exactly when she wanted one. That silence hurt, but it also gave her room to hear herself. The next afternoon, she drove to his building without warning and texted from the curb, "I am outside. Come if you want." He appeared 5 minutes later, folding his tall frame into her battered old sedan. "Do all artists travel in mechanical threats?" he asked. "Only the serious ones." "Should I update my will?" "Only if you insult my car again." They drove away from the city, the road softening into hills and bare trees. Luca kept asking where they were going. Arya kept refusing to tell him. 40 minutes later, she pulled into a gravel lot beside an old barn called the Westfield Art Collective. The paint was peeling. The sign was crooked. And the place smelled of wood, coffee, and years of unfinished ideas. "This," she said, "is where I learned to look." Luca stepped out slowly, taking in the warped doors and mismatched windows. Not exactly the gala. Better inside. The walls were crowded with old frames, student work, and photographs that had never cared about being fashionable. Behind the desk, Ruth, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s, was buried in a paperback. When she saw Arya, her face opened into a grin. "Well, look who remembered the peasants." Arya laughed as Ruth pulled her into a tight hug that smelled of lavender and smoke. Then Ruth turned to Luca, studying him without shame. This the expensive trouble. Arya choked. Luca, to his credit, offered his hand. Luca. Ruth ignored the hand and looked him up and down. Shoes cost more than my roof. Be useful and don't touch the art. Arya expected Luca to bristle. Instead, he smiled. Understood. Ruth leaned toward Arya. Pretty, but he listens. Dangerous combination. Ruth led them to the back corner, where 6 black and white photographs still hung on the wall. Arya stopped breathing for a second. A tired farmer. A waitress. A mechanic with grease under his nails. Ordinary people. Photographed without apology. I thought you took these down. Arya whispered. Tried, Ruth said. Wall looked offended. Lucas stared at the portraits longer than expected. These are better than the gala version of you, he said. Arya turned sharply. Excuse me. He winced. That came out badly. It came out honestly, Ruth snorted. Good, fight near the pottery. If anything breaks. It was ugly. Arya almost smiled. But the sting remained. Luca had touched the truth too roughly. Outside the back room, Arya folded her arms. The gala version of me. Luca rubbed a hand over his jaw. I meant this is where your work breathes. At the gala. You were surviving. Here you re-alive. The anger in her softened, though not completely. Then say that next time. I'm noticing I need a next time editor. You need several. He looked at the photographs again. Why did you bring me here? Arya's voice lowered. Because before I wanted approval. I wanted truth. I forgot that. I needed to remember. And I needed you to see I existed before your rooms, your money, and your doors. Luca nodded. I see it. Arya admitted her deepest fear. That she could not stay true to herself and survive in the industry that was finally opening to her. Luca did not offer an easy promise. You might lose some pieces if you are not careful, he said. Ambition asks for payment. So does approval. The trick is knowing what you refuse to spend. It was not comforting, but it felt real. When they left, Ruth made them promise to return and shouted after Luca that expensive men should buy local art. On the drive home, sunset bled orange across the sky. Luca thanked Arya for showing him where she came from. Most people only show me the finished room, he said, never the floor they built it on. The quiet stayed with them until the city walls rose around the road. After Luca got out, Arya sat behind the wheel, watching his building swallow him. Soon the holidays arrived. Thanksgiving was small, just Arya and her father. Cheap takeout, and the low flicker of television. He did not ask for details. He only cleared his throat and said, Saw the magazine email your mother printed. Arya stared. She printed it. 3 copies. He looked embarrassed. I'm proud of you. The words were stiff, but they warmed something old. 2 weeks before Christmas. Her phone lit with an unknown number. She answered, and Caroline's trembling voice froze the room. I just needed to hear your voice, Caroline said. Arya sat down slowly on the edge of her bed. Her sister cried, stumbling through an apology that sounded less rehearsed than before. Marcus had left her. And after that, he had used both of them to feed the story about Arya and Luca. The great love Caroline had used to justify. Everything had collapsed into something small and ugly. I know I don't deserve anything from you, Caroline whispered. I just need you to know I'm sorry. Arya had imagined this moment so many times. She thought she would feel satisfaction. Instead, she felt tired. Did you know about the article? She asked. Caroline's silence answered before her voice did. He told me after. Arya closed her eyes. And you said nothing. I was ashamed. No, Caroline. You were hoping it would pass without costing you anything. Her sister began to cry harder. But Arya did not soften the truth. Caroline said she missed her. Missed the sister who knew her before she became someone capable of this. Arya stared into the dark corner of her room. I miss you too, she said, and the truth hurt. But missing you doesn't mean I can let you back in. When the call ended, the silence felt honest. Not peaceful. She texted Luca. Caroline called. I didn't forgive her. His reply came quickly. Did you betray yourself? Arya answered no. Christmas passed quietly. Arya spent it alone, editing photographs in the dark, not because she was abandoned, but because solitude felt cleaner than pretending. On New Year's Eve, Luca invited her to dinner with his closest friends. No gala, he promised. No chandeliers. No strategic seating. She hesitated, then agreed. The restaurant was warm and crowded, and Luca sat with 5 people who greeted her like they had nothing to prove. They did not pry. They did not flatter too much. They told stories about Luca at his worst, which annoyed him and delighted Arya. For the first time, she saw him inside a circle that did not fear him and did not need him to win. During dessert, Sarah, a woman with kind eyes and dangerous humor, leaned close. He talks about you constantly, she whispered. Arya glanced at Luca across the table. He was laughing at something, unguarded and almost boyish. Does he endlessly? It's unbearable. Arya felt warmth spread through her chest. As midnight approached, they all stepped outside into the cold. No one made grand speeches. Someone surrounded cheap paper hats. Luca refused his until Sarah forced it onto his head, and Arya laughed so hard she nearly cried. When the countdown began, she realized she was standing among people who did not need her to be wounded or impressive. They simply made room for her. At midnight, fireworks cracked above the rooftops. Luca walked Arya to her car afterward, the paper hat still in his hand. My friends liked you, he said, even after I witnessed the hat. Especially after that. A quiet pause settled. Sarah asked if you were single. He added. Arya looked at him. Is Sarah asking? Or are you? Luca stopped. His expression turned serious. I am. Her heart kicked once. Hard months ago. She would have rushed toward the feeling, just to prove she was wanted. Now she let herself stand still. Ask me again when my name feels fully mine, she said. Luca smiled. Not wounded. Not offended. I can wait. He hugged her, and this time she hugged him back without fear. Driving home, Arya watched distant fireworks bloom in the sky. The ghosts of her past rode with her. But they no longer drove. Marcus Caroline, her mother. Every polished room that had made her feel small, they were still part of the story. But not the whole of it. In the months that followed, the January project began. Elaine was demanding. The work was brutal. And Arya loved it. The gossip post did not vanish, but the photographs outlived it. Some mornings she still woke with anger. Some nights she missed the sister Caroline used to be. Healing did not turn her into a serene stranger. It made her harder to lie to, including by herself. 3 months later, the magazine arrived, heavy in Arya's hands. She opened it carefully, half afraid the ink might disappear. Across 12 glossy pages were the women she had photographed, raw and unapologetic. At the bottom of the spread, in small print, were the words, photography by Arya Vale. No mention of Luca, no whisper dressed as credit, just her name beneath her work. She stared until her eyes blurred. Then she drove to her mother's house. When her mother opened the door and saw the magazine, she burst into proud tears. This time, Arya let herself be held. Not because everything was repaired, but because something true had begun. That night, Arya shared one image online, not to beg the world for approval, but because the work deserved to live. Messages poured in from strangers, editors, old classmates, people who suddenly had always believed in her. Then one comment stopped her. Marcus, I'm sorry I never saw your light. Arya stared at the words. Once they would have reopened her. Now they only felt late. She deleted the comment and closed the app. But Marcus was not finished. 6 months later, at Arya's first solo exhibition in Brooklyn, he appeared near the entrance in a dark suit, holding flowers like a man who thought apology could be staged. Luca saw him first, but did not move. This time, the choice had to be Area S. Marcus crossed the gallery while guests pretended not to stare. Arya, he said softly. I just wanted to congratulate you in person. She looked at the flowers, then at his face. You wanted an audience. His smile cracked. That's not fair. You keep saying that when I name what you do. A reporter nearby lifted her phone. Marcus lowered his voice. I loved you. I was confused. Arya felt the old wound twitch, but it no longer controlled her. No, you were selfish. You betrayed me. Used Caroline. Fed that article. Then came here hoping my success would make you look forgiven. The room went silent. Luca stood across from her. Waiting, not rescuing. Arya handed the flowers back. Leave my work alone. Leave my life alone. Marcus' face hardened, then folded under the weight of so many watching eyes. He left without another word. Arya turned to the reporter, whose phone was still raised. Print this clearly, she said, her voice steady. This is my work. Not his regret. Not Luca Davos' influence. Mine. No one spoke for a breath. Then Maya Chen began to clap. Elaine followed. Soon the whole room filled with applause that did not feel polite. Caroline S. Flowers arrived the next morning, with a letter Arya read 3 days later. No demands. Only regret in the name of a therapist. Arya placed it in a drawer. Not forgiven. Not discarded. Just held at a distance that felt safe. On the final night, she stood alone in the gallery, surrounded by proof that she had survived without shrinking. Arya had finally become untouchable. Not because she was cold. Not because no one could hurt her. But because she no longer handed other people the power to decide what her pain meant or what her future was worth. Betrayal had torn down the life she thought she wanted. And in the ruins, she found something stronger than revenge. Herself, so rest easy tonight. My friends, take care of your heart. Walk away when love becomes humiliation. Stand still when the truth is painful. And remember, your value does not shrink just because someone failed to see it. This is your midnight guide, wishing you peace in the quiet.